name's Ann Scallern, and I live here in Moscow with my husband Bruce and 2 kids. And today we're going to be looking at this meta-narrative of the Bible, the big story of the Bible. So I just want to welcome you. Thanks for joining me, and let's get started. Well, I think I want to start out by talking about a jigsaw puzzle. I have a 5-year-old daughter, and we love to do jigsaw puzzles together. And so the first thing we do is we dump all the pieces out, and I like to find all the edge pieces and build the frame first, and then study the picture and go from there. But my 5-year-old, she likes to study the picture and find her favorite thing on the picture, which if it's frozen, it's like Elsa. So she finds all the Elsa pieces, puts that part of the puzzle together, and then depending on how hard the puzzle is, she's either done or she keeps working. So we do all these puzzles together. Well, I have recently found this thing called a mystery puzzle, which we have not done and probably never will do, but it's where you order this box full of puzzle pieces, but you don't have the picture on the front of the box. And I think that's such a great illustration, because when I think about trying to grasp the big story of the Bible, like the meta-narrative, in a lot of ways it feels like trying to put together this jigsaw puzzle without the picture on the front of the box. If we open up to the table of contents, we've got like over 1,000 years of history. We've got over 40 authors from all these different walks of life, all these different books, different genres. We've got law, prophecy, narrative, poetry, apocalyptic literature, letters, all these different things, all these puzzle pieces, if you will. And so sometimes when you read straight through the Bible, Genesis to Revelation, it's hard to step back and see how they all connect together or to see the overarching story. So what I want to do is draw out kind of a map, if you will. Like, we could think of what I'm going to draw out as the picture on the front of the puzzle box, so that you'll have a mental map when you're studying all these little puzzle pieces, how they connect together. So we'll start with Genesis. In the beginning, there's this creation account where God creates everything. It's the beginning of creation, the beginning of humanity. So we see our first major theme of the Bible, which is life, or you could say creation. And then shortly after creation, we have what everyone refers to as the fall, which is the beginning of sin, broken relationship with God, separation from God, spiritual death, the fall. And so this is Genesis chapter 3. And we get our second main theme of the Bible, which is death. And then shortly thereafter, in the very same chapter, Genesis chapter 3, there's this glimmer of hope where God makes this statement to Eve. He basically says, one of your offspring is going to come and crush the head of the serpent. He's going to undo what has happened through the fall. So we have this glimmer of hope. Just in the first 3 chapters, we have the first three themes of our meta-narrative, which is life, death, and redemption. The rest of the story of the Bible is a playing out of the story of redemption, how God is going to redeem humanity. So our story really, and again, I'm not going to talk about every main character of the Bible just for sake of time. I'm just going to hit some highlights, some big landmarks, and then it will be on you as a student of the Word to go fill in some of those gaps for yourself. So one of the first main characters we'll talk about is Abraham. So in the Old Testament, we see this story of redemption play out predominantly through the nation of Israel, through the Jewish people. So we'll start with Abraham. God calls out this man, Abraham, and makes a covenant with him, or another word for that would be like a contract. And he says, I'm going to take your family and I'm going to multiply it into a nation. And I'm going to bless you, and it's ultimately through you that all other nations will be blessed. So as the story goes along, Abraham has a son, Isaac. Isaac has a son, Jacob. And Jacob has 12 sons. And then through a series of events, this family, Jacob and his sons, moved to Egypt. and they live there. And then over the next 400 years, this little family, Jacob and his 12 sons, grow into a nation. They multiply. And in fact, they become so numerous that the Egyptians enslave them. So we see the Jews go into slavery. And this brings us all the way up to the second book of the Bible, which is Exodus. And another key figure comes on the scene, Moses. And God uses Moses to lead the Jewish people out of slavery to the land that he's promised them. So through another series of events, and again, I'm skipping over a lot of detail, eventually this large group of people make it to the land that God has promised them. The Promised Land is called in the Bible. We'll just put PL for Promised Land. And we're just going to pretend like this represents Israel, the land of Israel. But before the people go in and settle this region, a key thing happens that's critical in their national identity. Is the giving of the law. So God gives his people this law. And you can think about it in a lot of different ways. It's really, we're going to think of it, for the purposes of this, we're going to think about it as the bounds under which this group of people were to live. So you've got moral laws, like the Ten Commandments come to mind. You've got civil laws, like how they were to conduct themselves in specific situations as a nation. And then you've got ceremonial laws, like religious laws. Here's how you're going to conduct your religious system and system of worship. So when we say law, the Jewish people, they think of that as ultimately as the first 5 books of the Bible, even though not all of those books are law. That's how they think of when they refer to the law. They're referring to the first 5 books of the Bible. And there's this statement at the end of Deuteronomy where the people are about to go into the land, and God says to them, I've set before you life and death. Choose life so that you may live. And so the nation of Israel living within the law is basically them choosing life. And Jesus even sums up he says the whole law can be summed up in this one statement: love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Love your neighbor as yourself. So when I'm going to refer back to this point in the story quite a few times. And when we think of law, think of it as choosing life and choosing to love God. So as the rest of the Bible is playing out this story of redemption, the rest of the Old Testament is a story of whether or not the Jewish people are going to love God. Are they going to choose life? So they go in, they conquer the land of Israel, they settle there, and then shortly thereafter, we enter into the time of the kings. That's supposed to be a crown. The time of the kings. And we'll come down here. The first king was Saul. And then after him comes David. And then after David is Solomon. And then after Solomon, something really interesting happens with the nation of Israel. So if you remember, this little family back here, Jacob and his 12 sons, they multiply into a nation. These 12 sons become the 12 tribes of Israel. And so the nation of Israel is made up of these 12 tribes. After Solomon, the nation of Israel split into 2 nations. So 9 of those tribes, or we can say 10, one of them's lost along the way, but we'll say 9 of those tribes become the northern kingdom. We'll put NK. And 2 of those tribes become the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was still called Israel, and the southern kingdom was called Judah. And so what this looked like, if you can imagine, is here's the nation of Israel, and it's like it's been split into 2 nations. You've got the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And each kingdom had its own line of kings. The northern kingdom had like 3 capitals, one of which was Samaria. The southern kingdom's capital was Jerusalem. And so just a little bit of information just to help distinguish, at least in my mind, it helps to know some details, why they were different. The northern kingdom, it had a little bit more political instability because the kings came from 9 different families. So there was some political instability, but it thrived economically because it was near all these trade routes. which also made it open to influence from all these other civilizations and nations at that time. The southern kingdom, almost all of them came from one family, the line of David. So there was some political stability in the southern kingdom that the northern kingdom didn't experience. It didn't thrive economically like the northern kingdom did. It wasn't as open to other regions. So what we see because of that is the northern kingdom eventually falls to a foreign power. The southern kingdom does too, but it survives a little bit longer. What we see, if you remember back here, God's given them this law. Are they going to choose life? Are they going to choose to love God within the bounds that he has set? And what we see on a whole, we'll start with the northern kingdom, is this walking away from the standard that God has set. And so what that looked like was political corruption, moral corruption, spiritual corruption, oppression of the poor, all this corruption. And so there's this downward spiral in terms of walking away from loving God and following the law. The southern kingdom is kind of the same. They would start to go walk away, and then there would be a king that would come on the scene and want to reform. And so it's like they would drift back to who they were called to be. And then another series of events, and they would drift away. And then they would drift back and drift away. So their timeline looks just a little bit different. So as this is occurring, we see some key people come on the scene. I'm just going to put some P's here for the prophets. The Old Testament prophets. I mean, there's a lot of them. There's Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel. There's all these prophets in the Old Testament. And they all come at different points on this timeline. But you can think of their ministry in three key ways. One is a part of their ministry was to point people back to what's already recorded in their scripture, which was the law, the Torah. So pointing people back to who God had called them to be. This is who we are. The second part of their ministry it was almost like holding up a mirror, like this is who we are now compared to who we're called to be. So I think of their ministry in a really easy way, past, present, future. So they point people back to who they're called to be, remind them of their identity. They also, it's like they did all these things to expose this is where we're at. This is who we really are. I think sometimes when you're in your stuff, you get this tunnel vision and it's easy to not see where you've gone astray until somebody holds up a mirror. So part of their ministry was holding up that mirror. And then another part of their ministry was looking forward, where they would predict consequences, or they would look forward to this coming Messiah. So there was all these messages of hope. So the prophets are on the scene, and they're trying to get the people to turn back to who God has called them to be. So moving along, we see this other nation come on the scene, Assyria. And eventually the southern kingdom falls to the Syrians. They have this series of attacks, and the southern kingdom falls to Assyria. And so what happens here is, it's really interesting. A lot of the people, the Jews who lived here, they are then deported out to other Assyrian provinces. So they're scattered around the region. And then other peoples in Assyria are then resettled in the northern kingdom. At least the one, so of the captives that survived, they're scattered and they're intermixed and they're assimilated into Assyrian culture and belief systems and worldviews. And so over time, as that goes along, one time I was teaching this and I forgot to mention, someone's like, what happened to all those people that lived there? And over hundreds and hundreds of years, the Jews that lived here, they intermarried, they intermingled, and then by the time you get to the New Testament, the ones that still live in Samaria are known as the Samaritans. Which is so fascinating, because if you jump over to the New Testament and you don't know all this context, you notice all this like racial tension between Jews and Samaritans. And where does that come from? And what's that all about? And a lot of that stems all the way back to the Old Testament, where the Jews from the southern kingdom, they kind of looked at the other Jews as like, They've sold out. They've bought into other belief systems. They've intermarried with other people. They're not really one of us. And so a lot of that racism that we see in the New Testament stems all the way back here. And as a sideline, there's this one story in the Gospel of John that I love where John is writing and he says that Jesus needed to go through Samaria because in that day no Jew ever needed to go through Samaria. They'd walk all the way around, but Jesus needed to go through Samaria. And he has this encounter with this Samaritan woman and the Samaritans. He stays there for 2 days. And at the end of that, there's this little statement where it says that the Samaritans recognized him as the Christ, the Messiah, not just Messiah of the Jews, but it says the Christ, the Savior of the world. And they had, if you think of them as outsiders, they got something of his kingdom that I think a lot of people missed, that this is the Messiah and he's for everyone. And I love that. Anyways, going back to Old Testament, the southern kingdom continues on a little bit longer after the fall. Oh, and some of these Jews, actually, they fled down to the southern kingdom and lived down there. Assyria eventually falls, and then Babylon comes on the scene. And what we see is the southern kingdom kind of gets in the middle of this power struggle between Babylon and Egypt. And eventually it falls to Babylon. And so, again, all these captives are hauled off to Babylon, and some of them scatter to other regions. And then there's a few that stay here. So a lot of the Jews are resettled in Babylon. And then eventually, I think, the Babylon falls, and then I think it's the Medes that are next. Eventually, the Persians. You can read about that in Daniel. Come back and fill this in for yourself. But eventually the Persians come into power, and it's under the Persian Empire that some of the Jews are allowed to come back and start to rebuild Jerusalem, rebuild the temple, but never as an independent state under the control of the Persian Empire. And that, in short, brings us to the end of the Old Testament. So a couple of things I want to say, because to me, when I'm reading through the Old Testament, the first 5 books do read like a story. But when you get into the Kings and the Chronicles and the prophets, it's not written chronologically. So that portion of the Old Testament feels the most like a jigsaw puzzle to me. I mean, it's really hard to navigate. It's confusing. And I think a map like this really helps me get my bearings and know where things fit, and it has some context. So this part where Israel loses their land is known as the Exile, because they've been exiled from their land. If you're wanting to study any of the prophets in the Old Testament, the writing prophets, this is the time of their ministry. And a lot of them will even say, when you read the first few verses of a book, it'll say, like, here's my name, here's where I live, here's the king that was in power. So it's really easy, or it's easier to find out where they fit on this timeline. There's other prophets in the Old Testament, but this Old Testament prophet, this diagram is just talking about the prophets that wrote books in the Old Testament. Okay, so this brings us up to the end of the Old Testament, the beginning of the New Testament. So in between the Old Testament and New Testament, I don't think I understood this until I got to seminary. There's like this 400-year gap where there's nothing recorded in the Bible. So if you're just reading straight through, it's like 400 years of missing information. The landscape is so different in terms of the Jews. The landscape is so different in the New Testament than it was in the Old Testament. For example, at the end of the Old Testament, we see, as a whole, on average, the Jewish people, they're in love with idolatry. By the time we get to the New Testament, they don't have anything to do with idolatry. A lot of the Jews in the Old Testament, they wanted to be like other cultures. They welcomed assimilation. They welcomed that influence. But by the time we get to the New Testament, they want to be separate. They want to be independent. They're clinging to their interpretations of the law and what it means to live within these bounds. A lot of laws have been added by that point. So we see almost the pendulum swing to the other extreme. At the end of the Old Testament, the Jews are in captivity to these other nations, Assyria, Babylon, Persia. And then by the time we get to the New Testament, those empires have fallen, and now Rome is on the scene. In the Old Testament, a lot of the Jews, there's no distinct political parties, at least that I'm not aware of. And then it's during this 400 years that we see these groups of Jews come on the scene, like the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and there's several other ones, the Herodians, and there's some other ones. So in the New Testament, there's these groups of people that are, who are they? Where did they come from? Another thing that I think is really interesting is through the Old Testament, we see God speaking to his people through all these prophets, speaking. And they're growing, the Bible says that they're like stiff-necked and hard of heart, and they don't want to hear it. But by the time the New Testament comes, they are so hungry to hear from God, because a lot of scholars will refer to this 400-year period as a time of silence where God is not speaking, that we know of anyways. And so if you can imagine what 400 years of silence does to not just a person, but a nation, it's like there's this famine of hearing from God. So there's all these things happening in this 400-year period. There's three other things that I want to mention that I think are significant. There's actually a lot of things happening here. I'm only going to mention three just for sake of time. One is Alexander the Great. I'll just put Alex. Comes through, conquers the known world. So we've got the Greek Empire. And their policy of trying to unify the world was assimilate everything into Greek culture. So let's everyone speak Greek, worship Greek gods. So after his death, his empire is divided between his four generals, and how those four generals went about enacting that assimilation looked like different things in different places. In some places, it was really aggressive policies, in some places not so much. And the response of people is pretty interesting. Some people, I think, really welcomed Greek influence because it brought some stability that may have not been there. It brought some unity. It brought security. Other places, there was a lot of resistance. And even among the Jews, there was a varied response. Some of the Jews welcomed the influence, and some of them resisted. So this brings us to the next key thing I want to talk about in terms of our purpose here is there's this family of Jews called the Maccabees, and they lead this revolt. We'll just put this Maccabean revolt against the Greek Empire. Basically, they do not want to assimilate. And if you think about it, if you try to put yourself in their shoes and look at where they've come from, I think a lot of the Jews felt like we lost our land because we walked away from who God has called us to be. And we rejected him. And so that's the consequences of who we've become as a nation. And I think some of them felt like, never again. We're going to cling to the law. We're going to cling to our scriptures. We're going to cling to our heritage and our identity. We don't want to compromise anymore. And so I think that was the heart of this revolt is we will not compromise. We will not assimilate. And through this series of battles and conflict, the Jews for a very brief time gained some independence through the Maccabean revolt. And then our third, and actually at this time where they had this independence, we see these key groups really start to form and emerge, the Pharisees and the Sadducees. We see other groups like the Herodians and I can never pronounce it, the Essenes. They were like the scholarly group. So there's a lot of good things happening at this time. But over time, the third main thing is Rome comes on the scene right before the beginning of the New Testament. And once again, the Jews are under control of the Roman Empire. So this brings us up to the New Testament. And this part moves along a little faster just because the New Testament's shorter. So if you think about, I actually think about this picture of silence, and there's this verse in Galatians chapter 4 where the writer says that at the right time, God sent forth his Son. Or another translation says, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son. And I think when I was in seminary studying this, mapping this out for myself, it's like most things with theology. You start out with 2 questions and then you end up with 20, because the more you know, the more you realize just how much you don't know. And so I would sit and stare at this and think about this, and I'm just all these why, you know, you make this, God, you make this promise up here that an offspring. I mean, why hundreds of years? Why can't like Jesus just be born in Genesis chapter 4? You know, and I don't know the answer to that, but when I sit back and survey this story, it's ultimately a story of God. The Bible's a book of theology. And so I think a good question to sit with is, what do we learn of God as we look at this picture? We see so many different seasons of people's interactions with God, so many different pictures of God. And so whatever can be said, the New Testament paints this picture of God filling up time. And then when the time was just right, he sent his son. And so after 400 years of silence, the next key figure on the scene is John the Baptist. We'll just put JB. John the Baptist comes on the scene, awakening people's hearts to someone greater that's about to come on the scene, who we know as Jesus. So when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, Jesus. And then we have the story of Jesus. And I think the more that we understand this map and the Old Testament, it gives so much insight into the teachings and the life of Jesus. He refers back to Old Testament teachings, and it also gives us insight into the people he's talking to. So that gives us insight into what he's saying. So much of this journey that we've been on culminates in the life of Jesus. I'm going to keep going, and at the end, I'd like to circle back around and talk about Jesus. So we have the life of Jesus, and then his death, his resurrection, and then we have the beginning of the early church. We see in the book of Acts all the followers of Jesus. We see all these letters to the church, how life in the church is supposed to, what it should look like. And then we get to the end of the New Testament, the last book, which is Revelation. And I know when I was in seminary, it seemed like I read that Revelation is easily the most abused book in the Bible. And there's all these interpretations and all these charts. And I think sometimes we can get really caught up in those things. But just like the Bible has this meta-narrative, each book of the Bible has its own meta-narrative, and they all feed into this greater story. And so when we look at Revelation and the big themes of Revelation, worship comes to mind. There are some really stunning scenes of worship, the worship of Jesus and him being revealed as God. There's this theme of justice. However that comes about, and whatever that looks like, there's this theme of God making everything right. And then the final theme is, you could say, restoration. Another word could be recreation, reorder, this idea of him making everything new. One of my favorite verses in Revelation at the end is where John says he sees the one sitting on the throne, Jesus, and Jesus says, "Behold, I'm making everything new." I love that. This everything made new. So the story ends with restoration, which brings us to our final theme of the meta-narrative, restoration, or you could say life. So I love that when we look at the big picture of the Bible, it starts out with life and it ends with life. It circles right back to where it began. So this is the meta-narrative of the Bible. So when we stand back and see this big picture of the Bible, this is just a general map. Some of it's a little oversimplified, but just a general map to help us navigate how these books connect together and the story that they're telling. So one time I taught this thing, and a student was asking, so at the end, what difference has this made to you? And I couldn't even think. I think it's something that was so close to me, I couldn't even think in words the difference it's made to me. Just like a jigsaw. So here's some ways that this has really made a difference to me. When I think of a jigsaw puzzle and I think of studying the Bible, it's really easy to just cling to, like my daughter, just cling to my favorite part of the picture and just study that. and not deal with the parts of the puzzle that are either tedious or they're too hard or they're hard to resolve. They're a little bit disturbing. I don't see how they fit with this part over here that I love. And when I sit back and survey this big picture, it really helps push me. Like, no, I want to understand why this is this way and why this is this way and who is God over here in this place, this book that's so disturbing, which leads to another way that this story has helped. I think I can look at this timeline and I can see so many seasons of my own life. I can get stuck on those 5 jigsaw puzzles of life that are so hard and so disturbing and so dark, and they fill me with doubt, and I can't push past them, and I forget to step back and see the big picture of my life. And sometimes when I look at this, it's the same thing. I can get so stuck on 3 unresolvable questions about God that just fill me with all kinds of frustration or apathy or whatever, insert whatever word. But then I look at this and I see I'm reminded of other aspects of God. And so it shapes me and helps push me forward. And it propels me to interact with parts of the Bible and learn new things, create spaces for new things in my heart and in my mind. So I want to end with one last thing. So when I was studying this initially a few years ago for a retreat, I was trying to find a way to demonstrate how this makes a difference when you're studying. Because the reality is when we sit down with the scripture, we study piece by piece. And when we go to church or hear a talk, we're looking at a few pieces at a time. And so how does this affect the everyday? So I was thinking about this, and I had this chunk of scripture that I had memorized like 15 years ago just all of a sudden come in my head, like a song stuck in your head that you're just playing, but I'm looking at this while it's playing in my head, and all of a sudden it felt so completely fresh to me, like I was seeing it through new eyes. And so I want to use that to kind of close this out. So it's the first 14 verses of the Gospel of John, where I don't think I ever realized how much of the Old Testament John is drawing on when he's talking about Jesus. So this is where we're going to come back to look at Jesus and how it feeds into this whole story. So I'm going to go through these, 14 verses, and I'm going to point to different things on here that stand out to me. And hopefully it's a demonstration of how this affects our understanding of just a small piece of the puzzle. So if you've never read the Gospel of John, John uses this phrase, the Word. In the beginning was the Word. He's talking about Jesus, and that should become clear. But as you're listening, if you hear me say the Word, I'm talking about Jesus. So in the beginning, and John is talking about this beginning, the beginning of everything. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God, and all things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and that life was the light of man, and the light shines in the darkness. And I look at this, and I'm like, in the darkness, in the darkness, in the darkness. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not overcome it. Or some translations say, the darkness cannot comprehend it. So there was a man sent from God whose name was John. It's talking about John the Baptist. The same came for a witness, to bear witness of that light. He was not that light, but he came to bear witness of that light so that all through him might believe. The true light, which lights everyone, was coming into the world. He, and this is talking about Jesus, he was in the world, and the world was made by him, but the world did not know him. He came into his own people, but they did not receive him. But as many as have received him, to them he has given power to become children of God, even to those that believe on his name. And they are born, or the picture is really reborn, they are born of God. They're not born of blood or the will of the flesh or the will of man. They're born of God. So the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as the only Son of God, full of grace and truth. And I love that picture, Jesus full of grace and truth, because it feeds on this whole meta-narrative. When I think about the law, we think of truth. Jesus says, I didn't come to abolish the law. I came to fulfill it. But we also see the culmination of redemption in Jesus. So this picture of grace and truth. coming together in Jesus, and what great news that is. Okay, so a couple of really good resources that have helped me as I've studied, and a great resource just for you if you want to go back through this in more detail. One is a Bible atlas, and that I got in seminary, and it was my textbook for several of my classes, and it's got a timeline at the top of the book for the whole, not just the Bible, but really world history too. So it's this picture of how the story of the Bible intersects with world history. So, and it gives all kinds of information of like what's happening in the background of biblical history, and also what's happening in the rest of the world. And so how all these happenings in the rest of the world affect our understanding of biblical history. There's modern day archaeological findings. There's all these charts that really help navigate some of these parts that are not chronological. I think it's endlessly fascinating. And so really this timeline in many ways is just a summary of different sections of this book. There's going to be a link in the description to this video so you can find these two resources. So that's the first resource, is the Bible Atlas. The second one is this book that I have. It's Introduction to the Old Testament. And it's got every single book of the Old Testament in it with historical background, theological themes, additional bibliography, if you want to look up a certain topic or whatnot. And then it has a section called Tying It to the New Testament. So it'll take an Old Testament book and show how it ties to a New Testament. It's so helpful for getting big picture, for getting details, but also getting big picture, how these things connect to each other, which ultimately affects our understanding of all these little pieces that we study and read. So there's two helpful resources that will be available to you if you want to do further study on your own. I just want to say thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.